Hey everyone, how's it going?
Hey, Sergey. I think we're just waiting for Steve to accept the speaker invite. Glad to see everybody finding the new link, and apologies for the technical difficulties.
Sounds good.
Hey, everybody. Sorry for the delay.
Hey Steve, how are you?
Doing well. How do you want to kick this off? Do we want to do some quick intros?
Yeah, let's do it. Awesome. Yeah, for sure. So very quickly, I guess Sergey here. I'm from Axelar. We're working on the interoperability network, and Steve, great to have you with us. So I'll pass it to you to do an intro from your side.
Sounds great. Happy to be here. I think the idea for today is to chat about interoperability broadly, and the article I wrote with the help of the Axelar team more directly. My background is as a finance professor. I've been a finance professor at the University of Oregon since 2011. This is actually my last year because the other thing I do is I manage a fund called Collab+Currency. We've invested broadly across the crypto ecosystem um, really since about 2016 with Collaborative Fund, and then eventually spinning out into our own entity called Collab+Currency. So we've closed about 100 positions across every corner. We've done interoperability, we've done layer ones, we've done DeFi, and we're probably most known for recently about investments around sort of culture and marketplaces like Super Rare and Art Blocks and Metaverse and gaming and so on. So happy to chat about any of that. So maybe I'll pause there and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds great. Let's see. Why don't we just get into this, right? Steve, so you recently wrote an article about market segmentation and fragmentation. I guess would it be a good idea just to start off and summarize that in a couple minutes?
Yeah, that sounds great. So I think the genesis of the article was really something I've been thinking about as a finance professor. So a lot of the stuff I write on Web3 has origins in something I've seen through the academic literature over the last 15 years that either maps to Web3 or doesn't map to Web3, or sort of like gives me some lens to think about something that's going on. And so one of the topics that's been investigated for some time is this concept called market segmentation. So you can sort of think about, dating back as far as probably like the Second World War, lots of countries had restrictions on who could own what stocks in terms of domestic companies and how much they could own. So, for example, there would be a country that would say, any country, any company that's headquartered in our jurisdiction can't have more than, say, 49% foreign ownership, or can't have any foreign ownership, depending on the country. So what happened is this segmented market. So it became very difficult for investors in one jurisdiction, say the US, to invest in a different jurisdiction, say Thailand or India or whatever, right? Because of these restrictions. And so finance professors started studying this phenomenon and under the sort of broad heading of market segmentation. So it was sort of like anything where there were financial markets in different jurisdictions and people, there was some sort of friction in terms of capital flowing between these different ecosystems. So the headline, I think, is that it generally inhibits financial market development. And so people started looking at examples where these things were eventually integrated. So, like the invention of the ADR, the American Depository Receipt, was like one method to start integrating markets. And there were other sort of liberalization measures that were passed in some of these countries. And in most studies of this topic have found that as soon as these markets were integrated, good things happened, right? GDP growth went up, cost of capital went down. Now, not all these things map to Web3, but I think what we've seen happening, particularly over the last few years, is that Web3 is really becoming a network of networks, right? We've got all these different networks between Ethereum and Solana and Terra and many others where there's meaningful activity happening, but there's some frictions to moving around between these ecosystems, much like there were frictions moving between equity markets in the real world. And so that was the genesis of the article, this idea that if there are solutions like Axelar that sort of relax some of these frictions in terms of the movement of capital between these ecosystems, that's going to be a net positive for everybody. And so the article really just walks through some examples, sort of like the idea of like if you have a pool of liquidity on two different ecosystems for the same trading pair, each set of traders are actually worse off relative to if that liquidity is pooled. So that's largely what the article was about, and happy to dive in deeper on any of those topics.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. And I guess just to kind of a step back, maybe do you want to talk about why and how we ended up in this world of different chains and different ecosystems? And I guess why do we think that's the world we're going to live in, right? Why is it not an ephemeral phase, I guess, in development? Like some people would say, Ethereum is going to win it all, right? And it's going to be the only network, or Solana is going to win it all. And like, why do you think that might not be the case?
Yeah. So look, I mean, I think many of us who started in the space many years ago, the place we all started was Bitcoin, eventually migrating to Ethereum, and then sort of all of these other smart contracting platforms like Solana and Avalanche and Tezos and others. I think different chains optimize for different purposes, right? So the sort of trilemma that people often speak about. So do you want to maximize on security guarantees? Well, you may give up something on, speed and throughput. Do you want to maximize on speed? You may give something up in terms of security guarantees. And so I do think it's logical for different chains to focus on different things, maybe different niches. Like, do you want to focus on being a chain that caters to NFTs? Like Flow is a very sort of like product driven chain, and you've got other examples, right? There's other folks that have focused on sort of regulated assets, chains that focus on features for regulated assets. I think it's reasonable to think that there's going to be different applications and different chains for different use cases, but ultimately the vision was one sort of grand unified set of ledgers, right? Like ledgers that work together. If we end up right back in this siloed environment that we've seen in traditional financial markets, that's sort of not good for anybody. And so I think, acknowledging the challenges you have with cross-chain operations, I think there is a desire for all of this stuff to just work together from the standpoint of the consumer, right? I know that so I teach this stuff, and I know that many of my students, some of which are sort of like full degen, but others are kind of coming to the space for the first time. And when you start explaining this idea that, oh no, you need this wallet for this chain, you need a different wallet for that chain, and here's the types of things that this chain are good for, and you start sort of like explaining this web of this sort of labyrinth, I guess, of different chains, many of them find it very confusing, right? It causes friction for user adoption. And so I think this stuff is going to have to fade to the background from the user perspective over time. And so that's why we're excited about, solutions for interoperability like Axelar.
Yeah, awesome, makes sense. And I guess if you had to, make a comparison between a chain and kind of traditional market, what would be the closest analogy? Is it a city, a country? Is it kind of an institution? Like, what's the closest analogy you can think of?
I think it's countries, right? And particularly countries with capital controls. So if you think about countries where it's very difficult, there might be a lot of economic activity inside of a particular jurisdiction, whether it's China or Vietnam or South Africa or wherever. But for whatever reason, there's a friction in terms of the capital leaving the ecosystem, right? Because of some capital controls that have been put in place by the governing body. I think that's probably the closest thing we have to different chains. Right now, obviously, there's not capital controls. There just has historically been a lack of great solutions for all of these things to work together in an interoperable way. And as we know, there's different bridges that have been built. There's solutions that look more like fabrics and an overlay network like Axelar. These things are starting to get solved, but historically, it was difficult to use Bitcoin on Ethereum. Like when like all the DeFi protocols were getting built, there weren't a lot of solutions to bring. A lot of the wealth in crypto was in Bitcoin. There weren't a lot of solutions to move Bitcoin over to Ethereum in order to use it inside trading protocols, lending protocols, insurance protocols, and all the rest. And then we had, centralized solutions like WBTC, and we had decentralized solutions like TBTC. And so I think, anyway, to answer your question, I think it's the closest political analogy would probably be countries with capital controls.
Nice. Yeah, and I think, by the way, that analogy also kind of extends to why interoperability as a technical topic is not trivial, right? Because if you think about it, you have these different countries that have different languages that have different rules and regulations in some sense, and on technical level that translates to different like consensus mechanisms, different smart contract languages, and kind of how do they all talk to each other, right? And how do they interact with each other? So I think that actually extends quite nicely why we need sort of a solutions that can be moving across borders and interacting with all these different languages and different barriers.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's actually interesting to dive in to, thinking about different chains as sort of like digital nation states in a sense, because there's a lot of literature. I mean, beyond market segmentation, that goes into sort of financial market development, right? And like, the way that investors are treated within a specific jurisdiction ends up impacting heavily financial market development within that jurisdiction. And so that, I mean, that's a nut. Maybe that's a future article, but it's something I've been thinking about. Is like how like these things we've learned about financial market development in the traditional world. How does some of these things map over to Web3, which is obviously like very different in many many ways? But I think that there are some things that are going to rhyme.
Yeah, for sure. I guess let's talk about the examples that you brought up in the article, which I thought were, very interesting, right? So, yeah, do you want to maybe kind of talk us through that? Because I think that kind of highlights, the benefit of what would happen if the chains and all these markets actually started to talk to one another.
Sure. So I've got an example in here around a DEX, right? And so I used a screenshot from Sushi just because that was easy. And so I took the same pair, which is WETH USDC, and I looked at the pool on Ethereum, and then I looked at the pool on Avalanche. And the pool on Ethereum is much larger, right? Which means that the price impact from trade is smaller. And then I just ran through sort of a numerical example, right? I said, like, let's say you had one pool with, I don't know, 200,000 USDC, an equivalent amount of ETH, and then another pool with maybe half as big, so like 100,000 USDC and maybe 50 ETH. And I said, what would the price impact be if you traded on each of these pools? And I won't walk through all the math here on the AMA, but the short version is that on the bigger pool, the price impact would be, say, 5% for the hypothetical trade I laid out, and it would be 10% on the smaller pool, right? So we see that traders are negatively impacted by trading on the smaller pool rather than the bigger pool, which means that you would logically see trade flow to the bigger pool unless there are frictions that prevent traders from moving across chain. But the more interesting insight is that if you combine those pools, right, so you effectively have now a pool that's 3 times as big as what the small pool was, so 300,000 USDC, the price impact drops even relative to the large pool, right? So I think the takeaway point here is that traders are better off from having this liquidity pooled. Like nobody's better off by having all this stuff split up across multiple chains, because if you can pool the liquidity, as we know, is a function of the constant product formula, just by construction, trade impact is going to be smaller if we can make these pools deeper. And one way to do that is combine liquidity across chains.
Yeah, and I guess while combining the liquidity, right, that's where we need, not just, we could have protocols that move liquidity around, but those are, quite painful for the users to use, right, and kind of a moving and shuffling it back and forth. And I guess like the ideal world that, we would like to see, at least at Axelar, is that kind of applications can combine and kind of talk to one another, right, and bring all the liquidity and allow the users to tap into it without realizing like what chain they're even at, right? Like that's the ultimate goal, where the pool is sort of unified and you can just tap in and kind of use the pool or do the swaps with all the benefits of the combined liquidity.
I think that's right. And one example that you and I chatted about before was sort of AVAX to UST, or AVAX to ETH, I guess, right? And what I was laying out was like behind the scenes, that might actually be sort of 3 separate trades. So AVAX to UST on Avalanche, and then UST routed to Ethereum, and then there's another contract called to swap UST to ETH and then return it to the user's key. But I guess like natively, if you can trade natively against a single pool without executing all those trades, which all will induce latency and gas, maybe that's the optimal version. I'm curious about your thoughts on sort of how this gets implemented in practice.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of ways to implement it. I think one is the way that you described, where kind of the liquidity gets composed through an application layer, right? So you have a pool on chain A, you have a pool on chain B. There is some common asset across them, right? And as a user trades, this common asset is used as a routing asset to move liquidity from one chain to another, right? I think that's one way. The second way is to allow things like wallets to go cross-chain and multi-chain in order to allow their users to interact with an application that may have a large pool of all the combined assets sitting on a single chain, right? So I have ETH on Ethereum. Let's say I'm using MetaMask, and there is a pool on Solana that's going to give me the best price for my asset, and there's a small effort that I have to do, which is just go to my wallet, click one button, right, and then my asset automatically gets routed to Solana with a message that I need to pass there. It gets swapped, in the DEX. I get an asset that potentially bridges back to the chain where I send the request from, or it stays on Solana, kind of depending on what you as a user want, right? So, ultimately, I think this is a pretty I think both cases could make sense, and but I do think for both of them to make sense, like you do need an integration with wallets, and you do need an integration with applications directly in order to prevent the users from having to move back and forth.
I think that makes sense. And this is scheduled to be a pretty quick talk. We only have a few minutes left. But the other topic I really wanted to get into was this concept of an overlay network, which I think is fascinating. And I just touched on it a bit. And so I don't know how deeply you want to dive into this, but I just thought this this analogy to Akamai and this idea that, you know, effectively the internet itself is a network of networks. I'm curious if you could just share a couple thoughts on sort of like how that relates to what Axelar is doing.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, on a high level, right, when the internet was developed, I think we saw a very similar segmentation, right, or fragmentation across the applications that some of them, you know, resided on one network, some of them resided on different networks. And then you had certain providers, you know, Akamai is an example, you know, there's a bunch of others, including like Cloudflare, that build kind of an overlay network that spans across all of the networks in order to provide services that are otherwise, you know, expensive or unavailable, right? And the types of services we're talking about, like routing, for instance, one example, you know, translation from a network that speaks a certain language to a network that potentially speaks another language, right? And just being able to find the most efficient path to go from a source network to a destination network, right? So, I mean, Akamai is a good example that did this in the development of the web, and like a lot of the applications that we're using today, I think something like a quarter of all the traffic goes through these overlay networks by Akamai that are providing these services, right? You could find, by the way, some of the services in alternative implementations, right? So you could get, you know, routing through a peer-to-peer network, right? Or you can get, you know, translation by baking in some protocol level translation logic in your front end of the application. But that's expensive, right? And that's costly, and that calls engineering effort and so on and so forth. And so overlay networks traditionally in the internet space kind of provided these services at a higher level, right, by spanning across the networks, having a global, you know, visibility, and then doing those services in a more efficient and a more effective and cheaper way, right? And so similarly, kind of Axelar network, you can think of it as it has the visibility across multiple blockchains. It understands various, you know, routing interoperability protocols from IBC to kind of our cross-chain gateway protocols that we have implemented, some other protocols for different chains. And so by having this global visibility, we can effectively route information, provide, you know, high security for it, translate messages from an ecosystem that speaks one language, you know, to an ecosystem that speaks another language, and you know, create this global and unified sort of economy that kind of you described earlier.
Yeah, it's a fascinating concept. I think I think the broad concept of an overlay network is one that we're going to see a lot more of in Web3 as we go forward. And I know you got a hard stop because you got a flight to catch, but I'll just mention that in the Medium article I posted, there is a paper that was written by presumably some of the engineers at Akamai, and when they were laying out like what the motivations were for the overlay network, it was things like outages, congestion, lack of scalability, you know, lack of security. And it was like, oh my gosh, these are the same problems we talk about in Web3. And there's sort of different versions of the same problems. But I think that in the same sense, an overlay network is going to make, or multiple overlay networks perhaps, are going to make sense in terms of solving some of these things. So anyway, we're right at the top of the hour. I don't know if you have any final thoughts.
No, I think this has been great, Steve, and thanks so much. So maybe we'll link the blog post that you wrote, you know, in the Twitter thread, and you know, folks have questions, we can kind of direct them towards that and take it from there.
That sounds great. Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Thanks, Steve, for joining. See you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We'll post the notes from the conversation on our blog, and you'll see those on Twitter. So keep an eye out for those within the coming weeks. And thanks to Sergey and Steve for sharing your insights.
Thanks, Galen.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Galen. Bye.